This video is not specific to UT Austin, but let's clear the air about one of the touchiest subjects regarding the college essay in general. There are many misconceptions about discussing trauma or injuries in college essays. Most applicants who have experienced significant hardship are afraid to share their experiences because they don't want to seem like a sob story. And this is something I hear all the time. Other applicants who have lived privileged or relatively trauma free lives worry about their lack of hardship or inability to write a sob story, and that will somehow decrease their admissions chances, when only about 5 to 10% of my students ever discuss any special circumstances at all. So, the first thing I will say is that students who have experienced abuse, neglect, crippling illness, physical disabilities, losing their homes or a loved one, or any other adverse childhood experiences would almost certainly trade in their grief and pain for a life with less suffering. One life pro tip post on Reddit reads, quote, "Don't tell someone they're lucky they had cancer because now they have a good essay topic." Close quote. If you don't have an obvious answer to prompts like the Common App's question number 2 that asks, "Recount a time when you faced a challenge, setback, or a failure," then consider yourself lucky. I assume you wouldn't trade places with a student who has stage 4 cancer, or who grows up in an orphanage or in rural poverty. Another Redditor reflects in a thread titled, quote, "A few notes on trauma essays" from someone who wrote one, that trauma can potentially be a hook, but is it a hook that you really want? I first started reflecting on this topic when asking a related question, and a broader one. Are there some off limits or topics that you should not discuss? Some admissions professionals take a very broad range of topics that they say you should avoid. I don't take that position. Those lists often include traumatic episodes or injuries, particularly in sports. Many blog posts tell you not to discuss trauma or injuries. But I take a much more narrow view and feel that almost any topic can be a potentially insightful essay depending on the context, why you've chosen that topic, and how you've gone about your writing. I've had many clients write about trauma or a sports injury and find success gaining admission to UT Austin and other elite universities. If I'm being charitable, I think one of the reasons that people have long lists of topics to avoid is that it's intellectually convenient not to consider nuance. But it's also the case that most college essays are not very good, which I discuss in separate videos. So it also follows that trauma and sports injuries essays tend to be especially poorly written. Not because the student doesn't try to write well, it's just really difficult to put into words complex feelings and ongoing processing around grief, loss, and anger, among others. In addition, deeply rooted trauma may not manifest or be accessible until much later in someone's life, which complicates the advice to simply write about it for applicants who have experienced adverse childhood experiences or continue to struggle with their identities in the present tense. I think the advice to write about trauma is much more constructive than the other side of the coin, which is to avoid it. When trauma or injuries are an essential part of your identity or background, then I encourage students to err on the side of sharing about it. Because when applicants get rejected, they then try and include their trauma in an appeal or a letter of continued interest. But that information is rarely new or recent since having applied, and that's what I tell them. You should have included it in your initial application. It's always better to share something than to regret not doing so. My advice then is if you have a significant trauma or setback that have disrupted your life or education plans, then I encourage you to make an effort to share about it, or at least brainstorm the idea. That would include sports injuries, especially if you are a high-level athlete who may have been recruited for an athletic scholarship. Still, you want to avoid hyperbole or exaggerating a minor setback by making it into a huge deal, because it's guaranteed that your reviewer will have already seen at least a few truly heartbreaking stories, since they read 20 or 30 applications every day. Especially during COVID, literally everyone has experienced at least some minor inconveniences or inability to pursue an internship or an extracurricular, so it's important to avoid making mountains out of molehills. Many blog posts and admissions professionals say only to trauma or injuries if you can put a positive spin on it or show how it's helped you improve as a person. It's regrettable that holistic review has a built-in social desirability bias that incentivizes students to commoditize and sell their pain for a possible admission space. However, I also don't think that trauma and injury essays need these silver linings, or even needing to show how you've overcome an obstacle or painting some rosy picture. For many students, especially if they live in an abusive or neglectful household, or if they're transitioning genders, the trauma remains ongoing. I worked with a client who wrote his essays between chemotherapy treatments and literally during hospitalizations after their physicians misdiagnosed their cancer multiple times. Some good might come from this child's experience, and I did hear from the dad that they got their UT degree and everything's okay, but it isn't at all evident at the moment when that student's lost their weight, their hair, and their typical teenage experiences. Other students experience ongoing neglect at home or severe bullying at school, and these things are tough to write about. There may not be any silver linings other than having the courage to wake up each day, get out of bed, and go to school. Given that teenage suicide is the second leading cause of preventable deaths among teenagers, it's a miracle for at least some students that they haven't taken their own lives. I don't think students are obliged to share how being assaulted or experiencing cancer helped them grow as a person, because it might not have. The reality is sometimes life is unfair and it does suck. Maybe you will take some lessons from it years from now, but perhaps you won't, and that's okay too. You don't need to tell anonymous admissions readers why having an alcoholic father makes you more resilient, or how losing your mom to cancer makes you more empathetic. It's okay and probably more honest to be bitter, angry, or resentful than to have an insincere, optimistic take. My advice is, if you want to discuss something deeply private and you don't want your parents reading about it, make an effort to secure your documents. One of my clients who wrote about a suicide attempt was discouraged by their parents from doing so. Those parents insisted on reading students' essays after we'd already worked on them and proofread them. They even told the student not to submit it. But then the student submitted the essays anyway, and they gained admission to their dream school. Parents, I'm speaking to you directly. Sometimes your kids write about things that they would rather you not know about. For example, being gay or experiencing a sexual assault. They might also write about your failing marriage. So if your child says no to you reading their essays, then respect their decision and discretion. In rare instances, students have written about trauma that they've had in their essays, and they've had it reported to high school staff. In most states, it's a legal gray area what responsibility universities have for reporting potentially life-threatening content in a college essay. Finally, what about admissions reviewers who read traumatic essays? Or universities who allow or sometimes require students to discuss a setback or obstacle or some related moment of realization? An admissions counselor on Reddit once criticized students for writing vividly about trauma or abuse because it is psychologically difficult for them to read and review it. But it's like, what do you expect when the essay questions ask about obstacles that invite these kinds of traumatic stories and imagery? If undergraduate admissions essay topics had questions like law or graduate school, which are a lot more typical and frankly quite normal, that ask you simply to focus on your interest and why you're a good fit for the program, then this would avoid the problem of potentially triggering your admissions reviewers. So the fault is with the universities and the questions that they ask. Students are merely responding to the questions put in front of them. It isn't their fault that life has dealt them a rough hand. Honestly, admissions counselors who are disturbed by reading essay responses need to lobby their administration to reform their essay questions. Moreover, especially if you work at a university that admits more than 75% of their applicants, I argue in my book, Surviving the College Admissions Madness, that your institution probably shouldn't have essay requirements at all. It is not a student's responsibility to put a trigger warning at the top of their essays for topics that you're requiring them to write about. And finally, if you're an admissions counselor who can't handle reading dozens of unpleasant and distressing essays, then maybe this profession isn't for you. If you can't handle students at their worst, why would you deserve them at their best? I know this isn't a pleasant topic to discuss, but it is an important one with a lot of misconceptions. If you want assistance on writing your Common App and university supplements nationwide, reach out to me directly at kevin@texadmissions.com and complete the questionnaire in the information section of this video for a free email admissions consultation. Thanks, and I hope you have a great day.